Hello, I'm Scott Swan. I'm from Arkema, and today I'm going to be talking about North American regulations that affect the HVAC and heat pump transitions. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background on the HFC phase down that's occurring in the US with the AIM Act, as well as how that compares to what you have with the F-gas regulation. I'll also be speaking about technology transfers and exactly what that means, as well as what that impact is going to have on the HVAC industry. And then finally, I'm going to close with a couple of actions around state regulations, which are still occurring, as well as what's happening in Mexico, as well as Canada. So to give you a little bit of background on the AIM Act, on the graph on the left-hand side, you can see the phase-down schedule, and it's actually the same as Kigali. The only difference is that it starts in 2022 rather than 2019. So the U.S. was a little bit behind in starting their HFC phase-down. However, they are catching up and basically going to be following what is in Kigali. The other part, just recently, the U.S. did ratify the Kigali Amendment in September of this year. So 137 nations now, and the US is one of them. Now, the phase down with the AIM Act has three pillars. And the first one is the allocation of allowances. So we call them allowances in the US, you call them quota. It's the same exact thing. And starting in 2022, there were allowances that were awarded both for production as well as consumption. The supply progressively decreases, so based on the phase-down schedule. And it's not product specific, it's based on GWP, and it's an aggregate of all of the GWP of all the refrigerants. The other two pillars are in progress. The first one is technology transfers, and what we mean by that is things like sector controls or use restrictions, okay? And the third one is reclaim. And reclaim will become a bigger part of the US market. Today it's rather small on the HFC side, but it will become a bigger part. And those rules are still underway, and they're not written and finalized yet, but they should be start being available next year. And they'll certainly affect the HVAC industry because HVAC is such a big part of the US market. So the graph on the right shows the differences between what you have with F-gas and then what happened with the AIM Act. They start a little bit differently, but they end up pretty much in the same place. This is as it exists today. Of course, F-gas is undergoing some revisions as well, and possibly maybe lower, but that's what it looks like today. There are major differences between the EU market and the US market. In the EU, there's no real HFC production, and so the quotas allow the holder to place the product on the market. That's the way it's set up when it comes to quota. In the US, it's a little bit different. Because there's so much HFC production, there's a separate production and consumption quota. And the consumption quota is based on your production plus your imports minus your exports, okay? So it's a little bit different. You need two different quotas when it comes to the US. Now this is a lot of information, and I'll be covering most of it in other slides. But there are 3 points that I wanted to make when you're comparing F-gas versus the AIM Act when it comes to the rulemaking structure. And the first one's in the middle around the enforcement and penalties. One of the problems with F-gas was that the enforcement and the penalties were not so stringent. And that led to a large amount of illegal imports. Up to 30% of the market was based on illegal imports. And the penalties were rather light. They tried to learn from that when they developed the rulemaking around the AIM Act and tried to put in enforcement, mechanisms with the EPA. So these included regular reporting, QR codes for identification, and border enforcement. The other part was, from the penalty standpoint, they're very, very severe. So if you have a violation, they're more than $100,000. And a violation can be as small as 1 kilogram. So it can add up very quickly. The other part is on the allowances. Allowances can be taken away from you permanently. So that's another part of the AMAC rulemaking. The next part is the package limitations. In Europe, you're very familiar with refillable cylinders. In the US, that's kind of a rare thing. We use mostly disposable cylinders. So that's a way to sort of identify illegal imports. And that's something it's helpful in the EU, but we don't have in the US. The EPA has basically made a rule that we will ban the disposable cylinders starting July 1st of 2025. There's more to it than that, and I'll talk about that later, but that's an important point. And the last point I wanted to make was on the bottom, the rule changes. So there are significant changes that have been proposed for F-gas, and we'll save that for another discussion. Someone else, I'm sure, will talk about that. But for the US, the allocations themselves, they'll be subject to change in 2024. So there were allocations that were given for 2022 and 2023, but there'll be probably changes for that in 2024 and beyond. The other part is the petitions to change the rules, meaning different technology transfers will also change in 2025 and beyond. So who needs HFC allowances? Well, anyone who produces or imports HFCs needs the allowances. And they can be transferred basically amongst the different producers or the importers. But there's a tax that's involved in that. And we call it a tax, but it's not really a tax. It's a loss in the offset that occurs. So allowances, when they're transferred, there's essentially 5% that goes to the EPA in that transfer. Some other things that's important to note is that when you import filled equipment into the US, you don't need allowances. That's very different than in the EU, where you need allowances in order to do so. And when they're talking about bulk material, they're not talking about bulk in ISOs. They're talking about material that has to be transferred to another container. That's how they define bulk before it's actually used in the final product. It's a little bit different definition. So who has those HFC allowances? Well, there's a pie chart down here, which I'm sure is very difficult to see back there, but there's a lot of different allowance holders when it comes to the consumption allowance. That's what's shown here. On the production allowances, there's not a lot of producers, so there's a very small amount of people who divide that pie up. So I spoke earlier about technology transfers, and I wanted to explain that a little bit. So there's a technology transfer rule, and it's likely to be similar to the SNAP ban. So SNAP was a program that banned certain refrigerants at different times. And that's likely to be what EPA follows. So they will be sector specific, but the EPA can define what those sectors or subsectors look like. They could also be product specific or GWP controlled. In other words, less than 750 GWP or something like that. Or they could ban specific products. And then finally, I talked about how pre-charged equipment, you don't have to have allowances for it, but the EPA plans to address it in this way. So, for instance, if they place a 750 GWP ban, If you import the equipment, it can't contain 410A or something like that. So that's an example of what they're looking at. So this technology transfer rule, there's a lot of them that are coming out, and they're expected in 2023. One of the very important ones that are going to affect the HVAC industry is that there'll be a ban, very likely, on refrigerants for new equipment greater than 750 GWP, effective January 1st of 2025. So this is a list of granted petitions that affect the HVAC industry that are being studied by the EPA right now. We don't know exactly which ones they'll adopt. They may change the dates. So we'll have to wait and see. Everything from the small equipment, which is up in the top left corner, to chillers are on here. And chillers look to be January 1st, 2024. That seems to be the date everyone's focusing on for chillers. For the stationary air conditioning, again, it looks like January 1st, 2025. And for VRF, they give you an extra year. It'll be January 26th. On the reclaim side, the EPA, as I said, they're still formulating the rules. So we expect something in the summer of 2023. That'll be sort of the time frame. For the state of California, and this is one to pay attention to because they're sort of doing their own requirements. And as of January 1st, 2023, you need to use 10% reclaim for all the OEMs when it comes to new equipment. So we expect that there's going to be a wider adoption of reclaim as we go into the later years. And in fact, as we get closer to 29, when the step down occurs again by 30%, it'll be very difficult to get through that step down without a higher uptake of reclaim. Now, I touched upon some of these other allocation rule and other requirements. But on the imported equipment, as I said, you can import equipment. It's excluded from the phase down if it's pre-charged. On the allowance transfer offset, that was a tax I mentioned earlier. For every transfer that occurs between a domestic producer or an importer, there's that 5% that's taken off the top and goes to the EPA. And then finally, the .39 cylinders, this disposable cylinders, those are being banned as of July 1st of 2025, according to the current rulemaking. And then there's a pass-through time where you have time to sell it through, and that expires January 1st of 2027. That's being challenged right now, and it's under a legal challenge, so we'll wait and see how that finalizes. The hearing, I believe, is in November, December timeframe. So that's an important point that we'll have to understand in the next few months. Okay, so states. One of the very important things that the AIM Act was trying to do was to prevent a patchwork of HFC phase-down regulations across the U.S. And it's been partially successful in that. There's 2 states that are still taking action, but for the most part, whereas 20 or so states were actively working on HFC phase-down, now it's really down to 2. And it's important to note in the AIM Act, it doesn't have state preemption, meaning states can still do what they want to do, except for a few small niche applications. Now, what California has done is they've passed a GWP limit, and it's for the sale of refrigerants, including servicing equipment. So not just new equipment, but aftermarket servicing. And I say in this table, currently proposed limits, it's actually current limits. This is the rule now. And so it doesn't really affect the HVAC industry so much in 2025. But in 2030, it will have a big impact. It means 410A is completely gone. It's not allowed unless it's reclaimed. And then 2033, it steps down even further. Now, the really tricky one is New York. And New York has done something very unique and concerning, to be honest with you. They have moved away from using the 100-year values for the refrigerant. When we calculate the GWP value, we usually do it on a scientific basis based on a 100-year value. They've chosen to use a 20-year. And what that means effectively is that it inflates all of the refrigerants to a value that's, significantly higher than they were under a 100-year evaluation. So this means things like 32 and 454B, which were the technology transitions that the entire market was moving to get away from 410A, is now going to be really challenged because it's over that limit. And so this will essentially ban them as of January 1st, 2027 in New York. Honestly, I don't know what will happen exactly because we don't know what other refrigerants are really going to work for the New York market. But today, that's the way the law stands. And then finally, let me close with Canada and Mexico. So Canada was a very early adopter of Kigali, and they're an A2 developed country, so they follow the red line, and that's the traditional Kigali Amendment phase down. The only thing that they have in terms of bans is on the HVAC side is chillers, and they have that for January 1st, 2025. So it differs a little bit from the US, but it's similar. So theirs is less than 750 GWP. For Mexico, they're an A5 group country, and their rulemaking is going to take a little time, but they are starting to ramp up, and we're starting to see more information being released from Mexico. Basically, they'll freeze the phase down line at 100% in 2024, and then they'll start to step down in 2029. So they need to get a lot of their rulemaking out over the next year or two, and we should start to see some developments there. So that's all I have for today. I'd be happy to take any questions offline over here, or if you want to stop by the Arkema booth, it's here in Hall 9. Be happy to answer any further questions. So thank you very much for your time today.